Hilchos Tumas Tzaraas Perek Shleisha Asar. The laws of impurity imparted by Tzaraas, chapter 13. We're continuing on the topic of Tzaraas begadim, Tzaraas that develops on clothing. And yesterday was more about the how. How does a piece of clothing become afflicted with Tzaraas? Qualifying lesions, the colors, the signs of impurity. Today we're going to get into more specifics about these laws. Which materials of clothing can become impure with Tzaraas? We're going to see it has to be wool, linen, or leather. There are some laws about leather. What do you do with a wrinkled piece of clothing? Do you have to open and spread the wrinkles apart, or can you just examine it as is? What happens if you have a piece of clothing with Tzaraas that gets mixed into other pieces of clothing? What do you do if you sell a piece of clothing with Tzaraas that's no longer owned by a Jew? And things like this. Towards the end of the chapter, we're also going to get to the Tuma. What is the actual level of impurity that's imparted by a piece of clothing that has Tzaraas? So basically another wide-ranging chapter. Let's dive in. It says that Rambam halacha aleph ein mitamin b'negoyim ela bigdei tzemer upishtim bilvat. Not all types of clothing can become afflicted with Tzaraas. Only clothing made of wool or linen, oy hashasi oy ha'erev shel tzemer upishtim, or raw thread that's going to be used. It's made out of wool or linen and it's going to be used to make clothing. Shasi is the warp thread. That's the one that goes along the length of the piece of clothing. Erev is the woof thread. That's the one that goes along the width of the clothing. So raw shasi thread and raw erev thread, as long as they're made from wool or linen, can also become afflicted with Tzaraas, as we're going to discuss later in the chapter. The chol klei ha'oir, and also leather, clothing made from leather, bein rach bein kosher, whether from softer leather or tougher leather, is going to become, or is able to be afflicted with Tzaraas. Af ha'oir hatzavua b'dei shamayim mitami b'negoyim. Even though yesterday we learned that when it comes to material clothing, they have to be white, any type of dyeing, natural or otherwise, is no longer qualified for Tzaraas. When it comes to leather, if its natural color is not white, it still contracts, or could contract, Tzaraas. The halevadim, felt. It's not proper woven thread. It's a clothing made out of felt. Ki begadim is considered like woven clothing. Umitamin b'negoyim, and they are susceptible to becoming impure with Tzaraas. Also, tents that are made out of material can become impure with Tzaraas, whether they were made out of wool or linen or leather. But those are the only three. Those are the only three materials that can become impure with Tzaraas. Halacha beis. Any clothing made of wool or linen, as the commentaries say, this means any means whether it belongs to a man or to a woman or to a slave, doesn't make a difference. They're all under the umbrella of being able to become tamei with Tzaraas. Chutz mibigdei goyim, except for clothing owned by Gentiles. Halekeach begadim min hagoyim. If somebody buys clothing from a Gentile, yiro batchila. If he finds a lesion on them, they have to be inspected as though it's a new lesion that's discovered there. Now it's owned by a Jew. Now it's subject to the laws of negoyim. Beged shehu kilayim min hatzemer vehapishtim. What about a piece of clothing which is what we call shatnez? It's mixed of wool and linen. Of course, it cannot be worn, but you have that clothing. Mitame b'negoyim. Even though it cannot be worn, it can still contract Tzaraas and have all the laws related to a piece of clothing with Tzaraas. Halacha gimel. What if you have wool mixed with other materials, other similar materials? Tzemer gemalim v'tzemer rechelim shetrafon zeh bazeh. You have camel's wool, basically camel hair, and sheep's wool, and you mix them one into the other, and you made one piece of clothing from it. Imreiv min hagmalim einay mitame b'negoyim. If most of the material in the piece of clothing is from the camel's hair, it's not susceptible to becoming tamei with Tzaraas. But if most of it is from the sheep, then that's what we go after, the majority, and it could become tamei with Tzaraas. If it's exactly half-half, we go stringently and we say that it will become impure with Tzaraas. And the same thing applies, with linen and hemp. That's a plant that looks very similar to linen. It's got a thick thread that you mix with each other. Same thing, since the laws of Tzaraas only apply to linen. If the majority is linen, it has the potential to become Tzaraas. If not, it does not. What if you have a female sheep that's the daughter of a goat? The father was a sheep and the mother was a goat. That's how the commentaries explain it. It's considered to be part of the goat family, and its wool will not become susceptible to becoming tamei with Tzaraas. Beged shahaya shisyoi pishton ve'erboy kanbois. Oy shisyoi kanbois ve'erboy pishton. What if you have clothing that the warp thread is linen, the woof thread is hemp, or the warp thread is hemp, the woof thread is linen? Einay mitami b'negoyim. it does not transmit or become impure with tzaraas. This is a bit of a novelty because as we're going to learn soon, that if you have raw thread, shasi or erev raw thread, in the state of raw thread, even before it's made into a piece of clothing, if it meets the minimum requirement of size, it could become tummy with tzaraas. Nevertheless, over here, once you mixed the raw thread and wove them together, they became a beged, they became a piece of clothing. As long as the entire beged is not from tzemer or pishton, it's not going to become tummy with tzaraas. Same thing as if either the warp or the woof was linen or wool, and the rest of it was other stuff, goat's hair, things like that. Once it's become a piece of clothing that's not fully of a qualifying material, it does not become tummy with tzaraas. Halacha daled, moving on to leather. Let's define the parameters of leather becoming tummy with tzaraas. If a hide has not been processed, it hasn't been tanned yet, it's not fit for use yet, at that point it's not able to become tummy with tzaraas. Even if a lesion develops, it's not tummy. Even if you have processed leather, but it's still unshaped, it hasn't been made into a utensil or into a piece of clothing, it does not become tummy with tzaraas. And the reason for this is, Shenemar, because it says in the pasuk, kli ha'or. When talking about leather, it says utensils from leather. That means it has to be in the shape or in the form of a usable kli. The chol kli ha'or. But in terms of utensils, it could be any utensil. Bein pshuteyan or bein mekableyan, whether it has a receptacle, whether it's just a flat blanket, let's say, kol shehein, whatever it is, at any size, mitamim bin agoyim, can become tamim with tzaraas once it's been made into a keli. Halacha hey, not all hides though can become tamim. Oides chaya shabayam, the hides, the skins of a living animal that lives in the sea, ein mitamim bin agoyim, cannot become tamim with tzaraas. Chiber lahem min agadol ba'aretz, but if you attach to this sea animal hide something which grows or lives on the ground, even if it's just one string or one strand of wool or linen, or any size of a piece of hide from a beast or an animal that lives on the ground, properly processed, and now from this attachment you made a utensil. Fascinatingly, this utensil now could become tameh with tzaraas because it has in it wool, linen, or regular hide of a regular animal. That's provided, though, that you do this attachment in the way that is typically required to attach two garments with the laws of impurity, which the amount for that, as the commentators explain, is 2 stitches. In order for 2 pieces of clothing to be considered attached, they have to be at least sewn with 2 stitches. That's what we mean over here, that these animal growing hides and other hides or wool and linen have to be attached by at least 2 stitches. Halacha vav, a little introduction here. The next set of laws is called Hilchos Metame Mishkav U'Moishev. It's about 4 people that have a severe degree of impurity, in which if they lie down or sit on something which is meant to be lied on or sat on, they make that thing a primary source of impurity like them. It's called Mishkav U'Moishev. The Mishkav U'Moishev, that which they lie on, that which they sit on, itself becomes an avatum. It's also known as midras. Midras means literally stepping on, but it's a term for if something has been lied or sat or stood upon, as we'll see all the details in the next set of laws. Not all utensils are subject to becoming Mishkav U'Moishev. Only things that are meant to be lain down upon, things that are meant to be sat on. So basically you could have a type of utensil that's really susceptible to all types of impurities, but it's not susceptible to this special severe type of impurity. That's what the Rambam is talking about now. Kol kli, haroy lihistame b'shara tumas, any utensil which could become impure with other types of impurity. Afal pi she'einu mistame b'midras hazav, even though it cannot become impure with what's called midras, when a zav, or one of the other 4 people that the Rambam will list in the next set of laws, steps on it or sits on it or lies on it. And the reason that it will not become impure in that way is because it wasn't made for lying or sitting on. Nevertheless, since it's an article, since it's a utensil which could become impure in other ways, so it's also subject to the laws of tzaraas. It could become impure with tzaraas. What's an example of these things? For example, a sail of a ship. A sail of a ship, as we're going to see in the next set of laws, cannot become impure to the level of Mishkav U'Moishev. But it certainly could become impure in other ways. So if tzaraas appears on it, it becomes tameh. The hapareiches, a curtain or a window shade. V'shavis shel svacha. Shavis shel svacha is what you see in the olden day pictures. They used to have like hair nets, like a little veil, but it was kind of like threaded or netted that would hang down in front of the face of a woman for modesty. Umitbechei svarim, and cloth that's meant to cover Torah scrolls. V'ha'avnet, and a belt. Uritzues minol v'sandal, and straps for sandals and shoes. Sheyesh ben reichav kigris, which the straps have to be at least thick enough for Tzaraas to develop on them. They have to be at least a gris area. So all these things, although they're not subject to the laws of Mishkav u'Meishav, but they could become impure in other ways, therefore they could become impure also from Tzaraas. Needless to say, any utensils which could become impure through being lied on or sat on by a zav, like pillows and blankets, they for sure can become tamei with Tzaraas. Different types of flasks, leather flasks, that basically would be sealed tight by tying. You kind of raise it up, hold it tight, and then tie it around. So where you tie it, of course, there becomes folds or wrinkles. It says that Rambam nirin kidarkan. When the Kohen inspects them, he doesn't have to open up the wrinkles or the folds. He just inspects them as they are. And if the lesion is qualifying, it's impure. If not, it's pure. The lesions on these flasks can spread from their inside to their outside, and from their outside to the inside. Yesterday we learned that when it comes to Tzaraas on the clothing, spreading doesn't just mean spreading directly from the original lesion. Spreading could even mean if a new lesion appears elsewhere on a piece of clothing, it's also called spreading. So here, because these flasks were used on both sides, both on their inside and on their outside, if a lesion appears on the inside and then a new lesion appears on the outside, that's called spreading, or same the opposite way. Same thing applies to all similar situations in leather utensils that are similar to these flasks and that they fold over and inside and outside. Their spreading goes from inside to outside and vice versa. Halacha zayin sadin hamekumat. If you have a bed sheet that is wrinkled, if a lesion develops on it, you must spread it out, flatten it, and open up the wrinkles. That's the normal way to use it, and then and only then inspect the lesion. Halacha ches hashasi v'ha'erev, raw thread, raw warp thread, raw woof thread. Bein shel tzemed, bein shel pishtan, whether they are wool or linen, mitamin b'negayim miyad mishayitavu. They can become impure with Tzaraas the moment they're spun into thread. Afal pisha le'liben pishtan, even though you haven't yet whitened or laundered the linen, v'le'shala katzemer, or you haven't heated up, boiled the wool, which is typically the way or the final process of processing the thread. Nevertheless, once they're spun into thread, they're qualified for Tzaraas. But they're only qualified in a ball of yarn or a ball of thread. If a lesion develops on it, it becomes tamei. How big does the ball of thread have to be in order to become impure with Tzaraas? There has to be enough thread to be woven into a piece of cloth that's 3 by 3 handbreadths, which has both warp thread and woof thread. Just a quick background here. Warp thread is thinner than woof thread. That's the way it was typically done. So if you wanted to make a 3 by 3 finger breadths piece of cloth, which is the minimum amount to become tamei, as we saw yesterday, and it will be repeated multiple times in this book. So you're going to have to use, all the thread this way is going to be thinner, and this way it's going to be thicker. So that's the amount of volume of thread you must take into account. Even if your ball of thread is fully warp, which is all thin threads, there has to be enough thread there that if you wanted to make both warp and woof threads, you'd have enough to make a 3 by 3 thing. Same with if it's all woof, which is all thicker threads, you need a little bit less, because you only have to take into account the amount of thin threads that it takes to make a 3 by 3 piece of clothing. So yeah, how much there has to be? Enough to weave from it a 3 by 3 cloth. Bein shahisa kula shasi, bein shahisa kula eirav. Whether the ball you're holding is fully warp thread or woof thread doesn't make a difference. If the ball of thread was not one long spun thread, it was a bunch of different small threads that are not attached, this ball does not become impure with Tzaraas, even though you have the amount. Technically speaking, you have enough thread to make a 3 by 3 piece of clothing, but each individual thread is a separate entity, doesn't become one big ball, so it doesn't become tamei with negayim. Commentaries therefore say, if you had attached all these loose threads together and they became one long strand, then yes, they would become tamei with tzaraas. Halacha tes. Shtei pekoyos shehin meuros zu bezu bechut. You have two balls of thread that are attached to each other just by one strand of thread. V'chein hashasi shemiktzasei lafuf ala koived ha'alyona umiktzasei lafuf ala koived ha'tachtoina. Or if you have a warp thread that's partially stretched taut over the two beams that are at the edges of the weaving machine. Don't have my pictures today, but in the standard weaving machine of ancient times, there would be two big beams at the edges of the weave, which would stand on supports, and you would stretch the warp threads over those beams, and then the woof threads would go through and through to create the weave. So you have now this chassis, it's partially rolled onto the koived ha'elyoina, which is the one edge, the one beam, and partially on the other one, which is the other beam. Also, you have two pieces of cloth that were originally one, and you began to cut them. They're only attached by one thread. They're almost fully severed, but there's one thread holding it together. And now Tzaraas appears on one of these. Tzaraas appears on one of the balls of thread. Or Tzaraas appears on one of those warp threads that are stretched onto the two beams. Or Tzaraas appears on one of the parts of the clothing, the cloth that is being cut. Hasheni tahar, the other ball, or the other part of the thread, or the other part of the cloak is pure. Even though one strand or one thread is attaching them, at this point they're considered to be two entities. Nire hanega, benefesh hamaseches, uvashesi ha'omeid. If the Tzaraas appeared partially on the fully woven part of the cloth, and partially only on the warp thread. Again, the way you weave is you have a bunch of warp threads that are stretched this way, and you pass the woof thread through and through. So in the end, while you're weaving, you may have part of the clothing that's already woven, and part of it hasn't yet been woven with the woof. This part is called the nefesh hamaseches. It's already been woven in with the woof. This part is called the shasi ha'omeid, the warp thread that's still standing. So if Tzaraas, a lesion appears, and it's on half-half, it's partially on the fully woven part, partially on the warp. Afal pisha miktsas hanega babeget. Even though it's part here, part there, it is impure. It combines, and everything between the two beams of the weave, even the part that hasn't been fully woven yet, is tamei. If the lesion appeared only on the standing warp thread that hasn't yet been woven with the woof, what's already fully woven is pure. If it only appears on the fully woven part, the warp loose thread is pure. Similar concept, if you have a sheet that at the edge has some loose strands, if a lesion appears on the sheet, you have to burn the loose strands. They're considered to be subservient to it. If they appear only on the loose strands, the sheet itself is pure. But if it appeared originally on the strands and then it's spread by a new lesion appearing somewhere on the sheet, the entire sheet, of course, becomes impure. You have a cloak that has a lesion developed on it and requires to be burnt. You can save the hems. Typically the hems in those days were sewn from different material. So you can remove them and keep them. Even if the hem was wool or linen, you can save it and you don't have to burn it. Let us say you have a piece of clothing that had tzaraas, but it's in quarantine. It's waiting to have its verdict determined. And now you dyed it. And when you dye it, of course, as we learned yesterday, it's no longer subject to negoy. Or you sold it to a goy. Now it's owned by a goy. What do we say in the beginning of today's chapter? Goy's clothing doesn't have the laws of tzaraas. Tahar. So, too bad. You made it pure. I mean, actually, too good. In other words, your act is significant, and you've transformed it into a clothing that does not have the laws of tzaraas. So too, if a piece of clothing that's in quarantine got mixed into other clothing, and you don't know which is which, kulan tahirin, they're all pure. Now, how do you have a case of a clothing in quarantine with a lesion that got mixed into other clothing, you don't know which is which? How do you not know? So the commentaries say like this. First of all, we saw yesterday there's a stage in quarantine where you actually would tear out the area of the lesion. So in that case, there is no lesion. So of course it can get mixed up with other pieces of clothing. But even if there's still a lesion on it, the commentaries offer two scenarios how you could have a mixture. First is if initially the piece of clothing came to the Kohen with a very dark green lesion. And then during quarantine, it got lighter. And that piece of clothing got mixed with other pieces of clothing, which to begin with had the lighter lesion, and therefore they weren't impure. So now you lost track of which is the one that was originally impure. Another, maybe a little more complex scenario, is where you would have had two pieces of clothing that both had tzaraas. One had the minimum size, which is a gris. The second one had a little bit bigger, a sela. They get mixed up in quarantine, and when they come out of quarantine, they both have a bigger size, sela size. So the one that was originally a gris and is now a sela is impure because it's spread. The one that's a sela and stayed a sela is pure, but you don't know which is which. So we say they're all going to be pure. Similarly, if you have a clothing in quarantine and you cut it up into pieces that are now smaller than 3 by 3 finger breadths, they don't qualify as clothing according to halacha. Tahar, so you've done good. It's pure, umutar bahana asay, and you could even have benefit from it. Hoysa bahan achas, shalish al shalish, v'nida banega. If, when you cut up this piece of clothing, one of the cuts remained with a 3 by 3 size, and a lesion appeared on it, v'nida banega, he levada tmeya, it itself is impure. In other words, once you've cut up the clothing into pieces, they each assume independent entities, and the fact that on one of them a tzaraas developed doesn't affect the other ones. Halacha Yud Beis, this whole last halacha is only if it's a piece of clothing that's in quarantine. Hasn't yet fully been determined. But beged muchlat, if it's a piece of clothing which was already decided that it's impure, shenis arev ba'achedim, and it got mixed up into other clothing, kulam tmein v'yisarfu, they're actually all impure and they have to be burnt. Afilu echad bekama alafim, even one in multiple thousands. Because once it's fully impure, it never becomes batal, it never becomes nullified. Same thing if you cut it up after it's been decidedly impure and made it into small pieces less than 3 by 3 finger breadths, and they're all impure and it's forbidden to have any benefit from it because it's a beged menuga, it's a clothing with tzaraas that's just has to be thrown out and burnt. Halacha Yud Gimel. Now that we've discussed all the laws for a piece of clothing to become tzaraas, what is the actual tuma? What is the degree of impurity imparted by these things? It says that Rambam echad beged, oy kli oyer, oy shesi, oy erev. Doesn't matter if it's a material of clothing, leather, or raw, warp, or woof thread. Hamusgar oy hamuchlat. Doesn't matter if it's in quarantine or decidedly impure. It's always the same status, le'inyan tuma, with regards to impurity. And what is the impurity? Harehu avme avoisa tumas. The piece of clothing with tzaraas is considered to be a primary source of impurity. Ka'adam mitzayda l'chal davar. The same in every way as a person who has tzaraas. Metame b'maga uvemasa. It transmits impurity through touching, through carrying, ubebiyah, through coming into a home. That's the severe tumah for a mitzayda. The oisa mishkav u'maishav. It also, anything that it lies on or sits on, meaning things that are meant to be lied or sat on, if the clothing ends up on them, it becomes impure. Afilu mitachas ha'even, even if there's an intervening rock between them and the object, the mattress or whatever it is, they become impure. Ketzad, what does this mean, or how do we visualize this? Beged menuga eishasiya erev eikli oyer hamenugayin. You have a piece of clothing with tzaraas, or raw, warp, or woof thread with tzaraas, or leather utensil with tzaraas, shehichnis mehem, afilu kazayas, lebayis toher, that you bring into a pure home, even the size of a kazayas, an olive-sized portion, nitma kol asher babayis. The entirety, everything in the home becomes impure, ben adam, ben kelim, people or utensils, venasu, kula, and rishon, natuma, they all become tummy at the first degree. Because the clothing is an avatuma, primary source, so it goes down one level to rishon. You have a mattress or a chair that's under a rock. And you put a kazayas of the clothing with tzaraas on top of the stone. That mattress or chair becomes impure. Halacha Yudalid matli sheyesh b'shalish al shalish, a piece of cloth with tzaraas that has a size of 3 by 3 finger breadths. Afal pisha ein ba kazayas, even though to begin with it doesn't have the kazayas of volume, and we just said that in order to make a house impure, it has to have a kazayas of volume. But since to begin with that was its size, once the majority of this cloth enters a home, lebayis tar, enters a pure home, timatu, the cloth makes the home impure. But if the volume of the cloth was multiple kazayases, once a kazayas goes in, even if most or the entirety of the cloth hasn't entered, it becomes impure. Now the Rambam clarifies one interesting point. Even though all the amounts, all the requisite sizes that we've been talking about for Tzaraas, really it's all directly received from Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai. Nevertheless, we can see a hint for this in the Torah, at least for this last thing about a kazayas, the volume of an olive-sized portion for entering the home. Harehu Eimer, it says in the pasuk, L'chol nega hatzaras v'lanosek u'letzaras habeged v'laboyis. This is the law. The first words in that verse are Zeis HaTorah. This is the law for all tzaras on the skin, tzaras of the bald spots, tzaras of the homes, and tzaras of the clothes. Hikish nigei adam and nigei b'gadim u'batim. So right here we see Torah putting all together, juxtaposing, comparing the tzaras of the human to tzaras of the clothing and the homes. Keep that in mind. The next thing we know is v'hishva ha'metzera l'meis. Torah compares somebody with tzaras to a dead body. Shenemar, when it came to Miriam and she had tzaras, so one of the prayers that they offered was al nasihi kames. Please don't let her be like a dead person, because Torah compares a metzora to a dead body. So if all tzarasas are compared, and tzaras is compared to the dead, ma hames bekazayis afelu bekazayis. So the same way a dead body transmits its impurity by an olive-sized portion of volume, so too tzaras imparts impurity to the home through a kazayis. That's a hint for this shear, this requisite amount that the sages received from Mount Sinai. Halacha tezvav, begadim hamenugayim. Besides for the impurity, there's a way to behave with these clothing. Clothing that has tzaras, mishalchen es and chutz la'ir, have to be sent out of the city. Like a person with tzaras goes out of the city, also clothing. And interestingly, it's even more than people. Bein shehaisa mukefes chayma, bein she'eino mukefes. Whether it has a wall or it doesn't have a wall. When it came to the person, only if it's mukefes chayma, they have to go out of the wall. But for clothing, it's all cities. This is a stringency that exists only in tzaras of clothing over and above tzaras of humans.